Good morning, and welcome to the 34th Annual Popcorn Forum Symposium at North Idaho College. We have many wonderful events scheduled this week and invite you to attend as many as possible. We'd like you to note that there is one change on tomorrow's schedule. The 4th Infantry Regiment's Band will be performing at 4 o'clock p.m. In addition, as indicated on the schedule, a group from Fort Still, British Columbia, will present a historical skit at 10 a.m. Then at 1 o'clock p.m., Robert Singletary will portray General William Carlin. All of these performances will take place here in Schuler Auditorium. And again, that's tomorrow. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce to you this morning's keynote speaker. Elizabeth Smythe Brinton was born in Toronto, Canada, where her family owned the Toronto Maple Leaf hockey team. Elizabeth's grandfather was Conn Smythe. For those of you who are hockey buffs like me, you may recognize this name. The Conn Smythe Trophy, which was named after her grandfather, is awarded to the most valuable player at the end of each year. In 1962, Conn Smythe sold his controlling interest in the Maple Leaf hockey team to his son, Stafford, who is Elizabeth's father. Under his ownership, the Maple Leafs won the Stanley Cup 4 times during a 10-year span in the 1960s. Elizabeth enjoyed these early years of success and fame. Eventually, Elizabeth moved to Aspen, Colorado, where she met her husband, Dr. Howard Brinton. Together, they moved to California, where they built their family and his career in medicine. Eventually, they moved to Coeur d'Alene, where they currently live. Elizabeth is an accomplished author and motivational speaker. She recently authored a book titled My American Eden about a woman named Mary Dyer who was persecuted for her beliefs in the mid-1600s. The book is currently being published and will be available for purchase this spring. In fact, we have some order forms available on the back table if anyone is interested in checking this out. Could you please join me in welcoming to the stage Elizabeth Smythe Brinton.
Thank you so much for the marvelous introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great privilege to be here today. I hold this honor very dear, for at this moment in time, I am representing my country, my beloved nation of Canada. How do you like living in the States, my friends from home ask? I like it very much, I answer. It's wonderful, but I am always homesick. I also cherish the opportunity to welcome Canadians to our beautiful city of Coeur d'Alene, the place I now call home. Well, which is it, you may ask? I answer in the words of Jesse Winchester, a songwriter who wrote, "Me, I like to keep my feet in Dixie and my head in the cool blue north." I see the relationship between our two nations as that of two brothers. How many mothers have said to how many sons, "You have to take him along, he's your brother." Or don't dismiss him out of turn. He is your brother. No one knows you better. He may have good advice. Or how about this one? You have no choice but to get along. You are brothers. You have to stick together. In preparing this talk, I corresponded with many writers, friends, and journalists asking for their input. Some of the responses made me laugh. You have a topic that is fascinating to Canadians and meaningless to Americans, came the answer from one friend. I disagree. I believe this country is undergoing a period of soul searching and questioning how the rest of the world views America. With great affection, I would answer, with love and hope and goodwill. There isn't a corner of this dear old world where in their heart of hearts they aren't pulling for the United States. Why? For the simple reason that we have to learn to live together. In the words of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, we all share this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We cherish our children's futures. And in the final analysis, We are all mortal. There are no two countries in the world more alike than the United States and Canada. One friend who pointed this out, a journalist living in Bermuda, said, "If you don't believe me, try spending the night with a bunch of limeys. You'll see." And I think he's right. Nations do have characters, and they are definable. Canadians and Americans both set out anew when we came to this immense continent. We penetrated this land through her mighty rivers and lakes. Les voyageurs, les cueilleurs du bois, made it as far as this very spot where I stand today. The first time I looked at a map of North Idaho and saw the French names, I thought, could it be? Just imagine what it was like in the 1600s, what adventurous souls left England, France, Spain, and Holland to set out to this wild place. In Boston, they believed they were back in paradise, back in the Garden of Eden. They thought they must be very careful not to put a foot wrong, because they feared God, having given them this great opportunity, would not be merciful a second time. Governor Winthrop wrote that they must be a beacon of light for the rest of the world to take example by. In Quebec, they sought to form New France, and from the beginning it was a race between the Hudson's Bay Company and the Nor'westers to establish the best trade routes and to furnish Europe with a seemingly endless supply of beaver hats. Our much-loved Prime Minister, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, whose family on his father's side had been in Montreal since 1659, wrote that when a man sets out in the wilderness, he has canoe and paddle, blanket and knife, salt pork and flour, fishing rod and rifle. That is about the extent of his wealth. He also noted that in this state, he felt in his bones the vastness of his land and the greatness of those who founded it. Both our nations stand on the shoulders of greatness. Both countries sought to find a way where all people, no matter their origins, color, or creed, be welcomed in their new home. And that with a combination of luck and brains and hard work, they too could have the same chance at their dreams. National identities are founded on heroes. Through them and their deeds, we seek to find the stars who point the way for all of us. We seek in tandem to understand and know this great adventure, these bold types who left everything they knew behind in search of something better. Our novels, plays, and films unfold before us, telling and retelling this tale of adventure. How did they fare when they got here? What obstacles were overcome? What barriers and prejudices fell to the greater good of becoming neighbors and friends? I have been hearing people say lately, when describing those with an axe to grind, that they just hate Americans. I don't like hearing those words. It hurts me, and I completely disagree. They don't hate Americans, I answer. They may not like certain policies, but they have not broken faith with the American people. This is the hope of the world, and they want Americans to live up to the promise of this great country. There is a difference. I do not come to this opinion alone. I have lived here too long, been treated too well, and welcomed too warmly to ever stand by and hear that the American people, the great, generous, kind-hearted souls that they are, should be content to know that they are hated in any part of the world. For our two nations stand side by side, defending this side of the pond. We may be the mouse in bed with the elephant, but when you hurt, we hurt too. I cannot speak for all of Canada, but I can tell you about my experiences, my family, and my heroes, for it is through them that one learns the essence of their nation. And there is no shortage of the most astounding achievement and courage on either side of the fence. We are more alike than we are different. The deeds I'm about to describe will prove it. The first great test Canada faced as a new nation was that of World War I. To part the mists of time, I will describe the hockey game that took place the night before my grandfather's battery shipped out. A man in the steel business who was making a great deal selling to munition factories asked my grandfather, Conn Smythe by name, if he would like to bet on his team. "You bet I do," came the quick reply. "I've got $100 that says we'll win." "I'm not interested in peanuts." My grandfather remembered that he had the gate receipts for the last 3 games in his possession. He decided to plunk $2,800 down. The man matched his bet, and my grandfather marched into the dressing room and announced that every nickel the team had in the world was now riding on the game. They took to the ice, scoring 4 goals in the first 9 minutes. Victorious, they set out to the Great War with $7,000 in the take. Sumptuous Christmas dinner, celebrated by the whole battery, 200 in all, was celebrated in England and carried on for years afterward. Along with that send-off, he also carried a letter from his father, who wrote, "You are going on a high quest now, not for yourself, but for the whole world. I do not know anything about the girl you were talking about Sunday night, but try to be in all things that you can think she would wish you to be. The war has interfered with many plans I had for you. You are going to England now, but not as I expected. I do not know what the next year will bring, but we are all in the hands of the Eternal. I hope you won't think this is a sermon or a screed. It's just a loving word from your old daddy to wish you all the best things in the world as you go away and leave all the old times behind forever. I kiss you goodbye and say love to you, my dear boy, your loving daddy." In England, they made ready, swapping bad horses for better ones. On Dominion Day, King George came down to inspect the troops. Cheers rang out, and off they sailed, boarding the train to Belgium, to the famous battlefield of Ypres. The British decision to hold Ypres at whatever the cost was founded on the fact that to the south was the Saint-Omer and the crossroads to the channel ports of Dunkirk, Calais, and Boulogne. These were the vital supply lines for the British, Canadian, and other Dominion troops who for years held that north part of the front. The Canadian 1st Division had been sent in to take over one frontage of about 4,000 yards in April 1915 and ordered not to yield. The trenches were only 2 or 3 feet deep. The ground was paved, as one Army report put it, with rotting bodies and human waste. The Canadians had only a few days to try and improve conditions before the Germans launched their first gas attack of the war, causing 2 divisions of French Algerians on the left to break and run, leaving the Canadians dangerously exposed. In the 2 weeks of gas, artillery, and infantry attacks that followed, 6,000 Canadians were killed, but the line still held. At the end of 5 months after the Somme battle had begun, the British and Empire divisions had advanced 5 miles at the cost of 420,000 casualties. The French lost nearly 200,000. The Princess Pats, the Royal 22nd from Quebec, the justly famous Vendus, and the Nova Scotia Rifles. These were the troops who, in places far from home, with names like Courcelette, were the making of our proud heritage. By their courage, they set an example that we have always tried to live up to. We wear the poppy on November 11th, and we will never forget the crosses row on row and those who lie in Flanders fields. Home from war, my grandfather married that girl he talked about, built up a sand and gravel business, and on February 14th, 1927, bought the Toronto St. Patrick's hockey team. It is fitting that it all began on Valentine's Day because it has been a love affair ever since. He changed the name of the team to the Toronto Maple Leafs and put the insignia worn on the hats of the Canadian troops, the maple leaf, on their jerseys. The next big move was to put everything he had down on one of his horses running at the track, with odds 100 to 1 against. His horse came in, and with the winnings, he purchased the great hockey star of his day, King Clancy. That was how it all started. In those days, the National Hockey League consisted of 6 teams: Toronto, Montreal, Boston, Detroit, Chicago, and New York. We needed an arena to match any in existence, he said. In the depths of the Depression, he set out to build such a place. It will never be filled, they said. You'll never get the money. No one can get behind this now. He refused to listen, raised the funds, paid the workers with shares in Maple Leaf Gardens Limited. And in 5 short months, it was finished. November 12th, 1931, it opened for the opening game of the season. Defeat does not rest lightly on their shoulders went up on the wall as the motto. In the States, he was often asked how to sell tickets. Start winning games, he'd say. We were never to feel that we could not compete with Americans. Hockey players had to wear suits and ties when traveling from game to game. The President of the United States may board the train, he'd say. Do you want him to think that Canadians are a bunch of bums? One thing everyone does know about Canada is that we love the game of hockey. We love beer too. We don't know which we love more. Please don't make us choose. Then came World War II. My grandfather was 45 at the time, and my father, like his before him, was 21 when he enlisted. I do not know if my grandmother tried to talk my grandfather into staying home. I only know that she stood on the platform at the train station for both departures, wearing a good suit and a brave face, telling them both to come home safely. Fearing that his age was keeping him from a good commission, Conn Smythe came up with a strategy. He thought if he put together his own regiment, recruited a group of athletes, and organized the whole procedure, that they would get their marching orders. So the famous Sportsman's Battery came into play. Men from all walks of professional and amateur sports, hockey, lacrosse, softball, and soccer, came to serve the call. He bent Army regulations just a tad when it came to his men. In June of 1942, they were ordered to the west coast of Vancouver Island because a Japanese sub had launched shells on shore. Since he had connections with the officials in the Canadian National Railroad, he arranged to have his company berthed in first class by mistake, with the bill going to the Army. As with many other companies, they endured the long waiting period in England. They made great use of their time, though, winning hockey, soccer, and softball games that would become their greatest claim to fame. Then came the last game before they were to leave for the invasion of Normandy, when a base runner slid into third and knocked his leader out cold, breaking 3 ribs in the process. When he came to, Major Smythe's first words were not to tell anyone outside the regiment of his injury. Word did get out, though, and my grandfather was visited in the hospital by a colonel who told him he had no choice but to send his men off without him. Reaching for his revolver, lying near the bed, he said, "Now listen here. I've been through a tough 2.5 years to get here. If I'm not going, you're not going." So off he went, strapped into the seat of a gun wagon. Because he could not climb down the ladder to the landing craft, he rode onto the beach at Normandy. As a child growing up in the 50s on a very typical suburban street that could have been lifted straight from Leave It to Beaver, we all shared the common ground of having dads home from war. Some had fared better than others. There were injuries, lost limbs, and shell shock, and these were sons of men home from the horrors of World War I. Yet we were all so full of hope, and our plans were boundless. It is often said of the American character that you can be anything you want to be. We were never told that, no. For one thing, a Canadian cannot be tanned in winter. We are dependent on foreign sunlight and have no plans to wean ourselves of it in the future. We are trained to be prepared for anything and to accept challenges that come our way. My first understanding of Canadian and American values began literally right on the border. We were on one of our many shopping trips to Buffalo, New York, believing that everything we sought to buy was better in the States. As was our habit, we stopped at the Peace Bridge and got out to the line of flags. We said hello to some other kids doing the same thing. I was about 7 years old at the time. Canadian or American, they asked. Canadian, we chimed. Too bad, was the answer. Too bad, asked my sister. Yes, I feel sorry for you, came the reply from this new acquaintance who was fast becoming a saucy boy, in my opinion. Why, she asked. Why? You're missing out on everything. We're the greatest country in the world. You're not even good at anything. My sister, who can always be counted on in these kinds of situations, said, we're good at being Canadians. When we got back home, we repeated this whole tale to my father. He erupted in laughter at my sister's answer. What should we have said, I asked. We are children of the same mother, he said. Next time something like that happens, just remind them that when they disparage us, they are knocking their own family, and that is never a good idea. We have to stick together. We fought side by side in 2 world wars, and that's the way it has to be. That summer, I went off to camp. On the first Saturday night, my counselor came into our cabin with sheets of paper, which he passed to all of us. These are the words to the Star-Spangled Banner, she said. We sing it on Sundays so the American campers can feel at home. We need to practice so we know the words tomorrow. The next day, the sun shone, and the lake was lively with ripples. Up the pole went the stars and stripes. The wind caught the flag, and we sang the American national anthem, as was our tradition. You gain an understanding of a country when you sing its anthem. You gain something of the emotion. A few years later, we were into the Cuban Missile Crisis. Early on, we heard the fallout would reach Toronto. My grandfather built a bomb shelter. One Sunday after lunch, we all went to have a look at it up on his farm. The walls were 4 feet thick. It was stocked with food, 2 sets of brand new encyclopedias, not unwrapped, the complete works of Shakespeare and other classics. What caught my eye were the instruments all lined up on stands. On top of the piano were instruction books, how to play the trombone, etc. We all looked at my grandfather and asked what the plan was. He explained that while in a German prison camp, he had won a harmonica in a poker game. How that helped him pass the time, he said. He would play it thinking he was making the sweetest sounds in the world. Tears rolled down his cheeks, he said. He was so moved by the beauty of the music. Then he found himself staring at a gun barrel while a guard yelled at him in German. While he didn't understand much of the language, he said he understood pretty quickly that he should stop playing. Out in the family station wagon, my father swung the car around saying, "We'll never survive." I had to agree. We were a clan blessed with many gifts, but music was not one of them. The idea of being locked up with my tragically tone-deaf family, all trying to learn how to play an instrument and arguing about who was better, seemed a fate worse than death. The next day, my best friend's mother came home from a trip to the store with a 60-pound bag of flour and a matching one of sugar. The prices will go way up if there's a war, she told us. So I went home and asked my mother what was going to happen. If there's a war, will Daddy have to go? He'll go, she answered. with a calm tone that I found most perplexing. "But why?" I asked. "We can't leave them alone in their troubles," she said. "We didn't leave England to suffer." Then she added that my brother would join too. I never felt more like the little mouse beside the elephant in my life. I remember thinking that we ought to make sure the U.S. didn't get themselves into trouble in the first place. And I think that my passion for American history and politics was probably born that day. Then came the news that we were saved. No one had to learn to play an instrument. We went back to being free again and living life in peace. That summer, when we all headed north to the great woods and lakes, the water felt so soft, the pines so fragrant, the rocks so warm and comforting, and the fresh trout frying in the pan had a particular splendor. Most of the dads I knew in my childhood worked for big companies. If they weren't American subsidiaries, they all did business in the States, and our economic prosperity was as tied to the American economy as if we were joined at the hip. It was essential that we understood what made this land tick. We grew up listening to American music and watching American TV. We liked what we saw. Then came the fateful day of November 22nd, 1963. The Toronto Maple Leafs took to the ice in Boston that night as reigning Stanley Cup champions. But it was at my father's request that the team wore black armbands on their jerseys. At first, the crowd wondered if someone important in Canada had possibly died on the same day. But when they realized the expression of solidarity and shared grief, the tears began to roll. When he came home the next day and we asked about the game, what it was like to be in Boston that night, my father told us at the kitchen table that the handshake at the end of the game, that great hockey tradition, went on longer than any other time in NHL history. In our pajamas, we went into the den, turned on the television, and saw history unfold. I had never seen my father cry before. On that day, I kissed his tears. There was no way to separate ourselves from the emotion. We watched the events of the next decade with a combination of hope and fear. The Vietnam War came home to us too. Cassius Clay, soon to become Muhammad Ali, was booked to fight Sonny Liston at Maple Leaf Gardens. My father had taken over the business at this point, but my grandfather could not accept the fact that a man who would not fight for his country could be welcome. They had a serious falling out. Then the war came even closer when we got a call from my aunt in Minneapolis. Close family friends had lost a son in the war, and now another had been drafted. They didn't want him to go. They wanted to send him to Canada. His best friend, our cousin, planned to accompany him to see him through it. Would we help? The answer was yes. Each of them had to decide that issue for themselves, my father told us. They lived with us for the next 2 years. Both of them prospered. One remained and became Canadian. The other returned. The pain lingers. Most Americans understand that English Canadians, or Irish in our case, may be very similar, but what of the French? They speak a foreign language, and in Quebec, they eat their fries with gravy. Pierre Elliott Trudeau breezed onto the scene, and we began to change. In 1967, Confederation was 100 years old. The Queen came to cut the cord, and we grew in a new direction. Sometimes in history, the right man arrives at the right time, and he was it for us. To claim that one or several leaders know better than the greatest number what set of actions is good for everyone is to strike at the foundations of social morality. What do the citizens want? That is a question a democratic government must constantly ask itself. For if it wants to establish an order which the citizens will accept, the state must encourage them to demand what they consider just. Trudeau stressed that the state must take great care not to infringe on the conscience of an individual. A human being, in the privacy of his own mind, has exclusive authority to choose his own scale of values and decide which forces will take precedence over others. Likewise, he never encouraged people to stay in office or to join him in any political endeavor because he felt very strongly that he must not interfere with their destiny. He grew up with solid roots in French Canada, but on his mother's side, he descended from United Empire Loyalists. When we needed one man to hold our country together, we were lucky to have him. When speaking of what brought him into politics, he said, "Each man has his own reasons, I suppose, of driving forces, but mine were twofold. One was to make sure that Quebec would not leave Canada, and the other was to make sure that Canada wouldn't shove Quebec out through narrow-mindedness. Church and state had been more or less one for centuries in Quebec. It was a society turned inward to itself, shunning outside interest. Through election, this began to change, as did demands coming from Quebec to the rest of the nation. Trudeau's approach was based on a conviction that Canada could only survive if all citizens, French or English, regarded every part of Canada as their own. So came the Official Languages Act. Oh, how they roared. The directions on Campbell's soup cans will have to be printed in French. All the street signs will have to change. Do you have any idea what this will cost? Well, what would be the cost of dividing into two nations, eh? At camp, we started singing the national anthem in French. Once again, the words were passed around. We went from God Save the Queen and Flying the Old Ensign to incorporating the Stars and Stripes and the Star-Spangled Banner on Sundays, to O Canada, then to the new flag, then O Canada and the new flag, but in French this time, if you please. We are an adaptable nation. As we had immigrants pouring into our country from every corner of the planet, the global village, the term coined by Marshall McLuhan, came home to us, perfectly visible on every street and subway car. We continue to strive to make everyone feel welcome. Isn't that the challenge constantly facing us all? How do we best adapt to changing circumstances and times? Thomas Paine, in Common Sense, brought to mind the words of Dragonetti. The science of the politician consists in fixing the true point of happiness and freedom. Those men would deserve the gratitude of ages who should discover a mode of government that contains the greatest sum of individual happiness with the least national expense. There is not a nation anywhere in the world that would not agree with that formula, yet it will always remain an elusive ideal. We were not taught to expect happiness or the pursuit of happiness in Canada. That seemed to be our own responsibility. What we could expect, though, was law and order and good government. Even in the West, the law in the form of the Mountie came first. The Puritans of New England set out to form good government, but in their zeal, they became a theocracy. The period in which my novel is set, from 1635 to 1660, in that time, England fell into civil war. Parliament was reduced to what was known as the Rump, and then disbanded by King Charles I. As Winston Churchill described in the History of the English-speaking Peoples, the new merchant class, Protestant and gaining momentum, rose up to challenge the old Catholic nobles. With Oliver Cromwell as their champion, civil liberties and democracy, in place in one form or another for 300 years, fell by the wayside. The House of Lords was abolished. At first, the goals were lofty. All representation should rest with the people in a true parliament, and no one body should hold sway over the other. It would be like doing away with the Senate. Although seats are not hereditary, some comparisons could be made. However, that did not last either. England slid into war, and no one side had representation. Cromwell became a military dictator, and in a sham court of his own design, presided over the trial and execution of his own king. Far away in Boston and Newport, the people read accounts of these affairs months after they had taken place. They felt very much on their own. Adapting to a new identity as colonials meant seeing themselves as totally separate from an England they no longer understood. At home, village life went all out of kilter. Puritans kept passing new edicts from a body Cromwell put together by passing out certificates. The Saints, as they called this sham of a house, passed a law forbidding anyone to cook a goose on Christmas Day. In this troubled and confusing time, new religious sects sprang up all over the land, one being the Religious Society of Friends, somewhat derogatorily called Quakers. Inroads into New England alarmed the Boston magistrates to such a degree they passed laws to keep them out. Those who had left England to escape persecution from the Anglican Church had become decidedly intolerant. Whippings, fines, having tongues bored, and ears cut off did not stop them from coming until they went so far as to banish Quakers on pain of death. Challenging the law, 4 Quakers gave their lives for the cause of freedom. Mary Dyer did this twice. The first time she was given a reprieve, the second ended her life. In today's time, we hear so much about religious martyrdom, it is almost becoming commonplace. In researching and writing about this first great act of civil disobedience to take place on American soil, I had to really ask myself, what would ever cause me to do such a thing? As a mother and lover of life and liberty, I was hard-pressed to come up with anything that would take precedence over my duty to my family and children. Then my daughter asked me what I would do if a law were passed banning all books. What if they closed the libraries? Well, I said, I would tell you guys not to forget to eat the fresh food in the fridge, and then I would head off to Washington to march with the other mums. And if it would help preserve freedom of thought in this world to give up my life, then I think I would say, help yourself. You can have my dead body if you can find a use for it. At that point, I was right in the same mindset as Mary Dyer. Life without freedom, she wrote from her unheated prison cell, is not worth living. The magistrates had said, we shall be as willing to take your lives as you are to lay them down. Thomas Paine, having spent his early childhood in England as a weaver's son and attending Quaker schools, would have known well the sufferings of the 1650s. So when turning his mind to the business of the Continental Charter, he described securing freedom and property to all men, and above all things, the free exercise of religion, each according to the dictates of his conscience. While I was trying to envision the English Civil War, another vote for referendum came up in Quebec. The vote was agonizingly close. I don't think I'll ever forget that night. My sister and I racked up record long distance phone bills, even for us. At one point she said, it's 51-49 in favor. I fell on my knees and beseeched her to do the same. We prayed and cried together, hoping against hope that our nation would hold together. Then it was over. We squeaked through by a hair, and we were still united from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The maple leaf flew from coast to coast. The next day, the headlines in the Toronto papers called it the night we finally got emotional. If the province had decided to leave, would we turn our guns on old Quebec? No, I feel quite strongly that we would not. We would do our best to make it work, because that is our way. For so long, we didn't know who we really were. How could we form an identity in the face of being 1/10 the population of the United States and blasted from morning until night with television, radio, and film as we huddle close to the border? How could we ever grow out from the shadow of this big brother, always smirking at us when we tried to do anything new? How could we move away from England, France, and the United States to form a culture that was unique to Canada? Well, I maintain that we have done it. We do know who we are, and we are different. If you ask Canadians from the west down to the east, what was the most important moment in Canadian history, they would say to a man, woman, and child that it happened when Paul Henderson of the Toronto Maple Leafs scored the winning goal in the Team Canada series against the Russians. With the series tied up, the tension was such that the children were let out of school to watch the game. It was a bittersweet victory for us, as the series had been an abiding dream of my father's, which he did not live to see. It was not enough to assume that if we ever had the chance to put the best NHL players against the Russians, we would naturally reign supreme. We had to be put to the test, and it was not an easy one. What was the greatest moment in American sports in the last century, from our perspective? Without a doubt, it was the Miracle on Ice of 1980. For us, that felt like having our team eliminated, but seeing our brothers win against all odds. Also, we now had this bond. We had both beaten the Russians and both experienced a wave of nationalism in the process. It is a good thing. We have our flag, we have our two languages, we have our game, and what else do we have? Beer, yes. Song sheets, yes. And what else? Oh yeah, comedy. We are exporting laughter. On a recent Simpsons episode, Homer ran amok on the palace grounds and had to appear before the Queen. He said, "You have to love us. We're one of your children." Okay, so we're not one of the good children like the Canadians. When I was at a conference recently, I was discussing this topic with an American journalist, naming how many comedians are from Canada. The late, great John Candy, Dan Aykroyd, Martin Short, Mike Myers, Rick Moranis, Andrea Martin, Jim Carrey, Robin Williams. Oh, whoopsies, he's still yours. So my friend said, "Yeah, what the heck is going on when the Canadians are hipper than we are?" We tend not to pry too much into the religious beliefs of our prime ministers. Pierre Trudeau was asked, though, and he spoke eloquently on the subject, but ended saying that in principle, he agreed with Thomas Paine. He believed his religion was about doing good. When Trudeau died, we felt another burst of unity. I first read Justin Trudeau's moving eulogy when my mother clipped it from the paper and sent it to me. Then I heard a recording, and eventually I saw the film clip. What he said in that speech articulated for once and for all what we really stand for. Justin told the story of having lunch with his father in the parliamentary dining room. He told a joke picked up on the schoolyard that made fun of his father's opponent. Justin said that his father looked at him sternly, with that look he would learn to know so well, and said, "Justin, never attack the individual. We can be in total disagreement with someone without denigrating them as a consequence." Justin said that he was taken over by his father to meet the man and his daughter. From this, his son learned that having opinions that are different from one another does not preclude one being deserving of respect as an individual. This simple tolerance and recognition of the real and profound dimensions of each human being, regardless of beliefs, origins, or values. That's what he expected of his children, and that's what he expected of our country. We are the true North, strong and free. How can we have freedom without tolerance? How can democracy flourish if we do not stand back and allow it to draw a breath of fresh air? De Tocqueville wrote that democracy depends on a civil society. Our civility as Canadians, long the brunt of how many jokes about how dull we are, or how dull we used to be rather, can be depended upon. We can offer solutions, from the Iran hostage crisis to Afghanistan, where our finest young men and women from the time-honored Princess Pats, the Quebec Vendus, and the Nova Scotia Rifles have sent troops to side with our neighbor and brother. For the Bible tells us, no greater love hath man than this, that he would lay down his life for a friend. Some of our own have come home, draped under the maple leaf flag. I can think of no greater expression of our commitment than to stand beside a friend in a time of need. As Canadians, we depend on these certainties. We are the true North, strong and free. We are glorious and free. We stand on guard. We love freedom every bit as much as you do. If you take home nothing else from this morning, from this spot, this site of many a rendezvous, please remember that we stand on guard for thee too. Thank you.
Making things in French for Quebec.
The Official Languages Act. That was when we became bilingual as a country.
Official language, what act?
Official Languages Act.
Act, okay. And on November 22nd, maybe I'm really bad on my history, what was it that made them wear the armbands?
President Kennedy was assassinated.
Wow, I feel dumb. Okay, that was it. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's great to get those gaps in your notes. That's always good. Who's next, please? Don't be shy. Over here's a question.
I wonder why you have chosen to live in the United States.
That's a very good question, and I can point to my darling husband who is manning the camera there. I met this man many years ago, and I would follow him to the moon. His family have been in the States since they originally came over with William Penn to form Pennsylvania and have been here all this time. So we are a blend of our two nations, and we're both devoted to our two countries.
Next question. Then I'll ask one. I always go last, but the others can ask them. I'll just ask while they're thinking. Elizabeth, we did a TV show yesterday, and you were wonderful in that also. One of the things that's going on this week is, and a lot of that came out in your address, and it has to do with how we are very much alike and how we're different. What are the 2 or 3 points that you think that we're most alike about, first of all? How we're so similar?
I think our history is very similar in that most families will go back to the one who came over and tell the tale within their own homes of their struggle as pioneers to start anew. We do have that in common. We also have this background of being children of the same mother, although there have been, there has been a fork in the road, that root is still in place. And I think that we both do love democracy and freedom, and we're both very proud of our heritage.
And in what ways are we very, very different, in addition to what you said in your address?
Well,
we also like beer too, you know.
Differences between us have to do with the way our two governments are set up. We do have to be so conscious of Canadians of our role in the world. We are very dedicated to trying not to put a foot wrong. So we are always making sure that we know everything, first and foremost, about what's happening here and what's happening there, and oh my goodness. And I think in the United States, and I really understood this more when I was reading Thomas Paine's Common Sense, when he he pled with people in his new country to see that they had everything they needed right here, and they didn't have to look abroad or look to the left or look to the right, because everything they needed was within these borders. And I see that as the difference between us, our two countries.
Right. Other questions? Anyone else?
Yes, it's a
Right
question.
here.
Right?
Our friend for many years. Good to see you.
Elizabeth, Ross Woodward, we talked yesterday, and you did a wonderful job.
Thank you.
Just a fantastic job. What can we Canadian Americans, you and I and others, what can we do to make Canada more in the minds of this continent? It was alluded yesterday to the fact that Americans know so little about Canada and don't seem very interested in, unless we get into some sort of conflict or unless we want to take a fantastic vacation. What can we do to bring Canadian culture into the American culture so that we can understand the history of Canada with the same acuity that we do the history of the United States? We're together in terms of geography, we're together in terms of a common background and so on, but how can we bridge this cultural gap so that we can fuse it together and present ourselves as indeed North America?
I love that question, and thank you so much for asking it. It's very important. And I would say, first and foremost, don't forget us. We had to endure hearing every country just about in the world named as a friend to the United States, with Canada left out altogether. And I know every single Canadian yelled at their television set when that happened. We are the best friend that the United States has, and Great Britain as well, and always will be. So my first advice would be, please don't forget us and ignore us, and please come up and visit. Play a game or two. Take up curling. Go to a tournament. Play golf. Get in on some of these good prices that with the exchange rate, and you'll see you'll have a great time. We're a lot of fun. So that would be my first thing I would say is please come and visit, get to know us, and you'll enjoy it. I know it. Yeah.
I'll bring you the microphone. Can we get you on the mic because of the TV, please? Thank you.
One of the important things that's been done and is ongoing to get more interest in Canada on the part of Americans is the establishment of Canadian studies programs at American universities. There are several of them that are quite strong. You've got one at Western Washington University in Bellingham that's one of the best. Michigan State has one. The University of Vermont has one. Two campuses in the State University of New York system have one. But we can do an awful, and the Canadian government is very interested in expanding such programs. So anything you can do to encourage your state legislature or the administrations of your universities to develop courses and programs, some of them possible leading to a degree in Canadian studies, that's a big help.
This is Dr. Olskamp, who was our keynote speaker yesterday, former president of Western Washington University.
And I venture to say the Canadian government would probably help out with the funds there too, wouldn't they, Dr. Oldskamp?
I think it's not so much a matter of being forgotten or ignored. It's that you do not need to acknowledge a brother as you do others outside of the family.
What a sweet thing to say. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Any other questions? Before we adjourn, I want to do two things. One is, again, I want to thank Elizabeth. I made your acquaintance during this process, and you and your family are just absolutely wonderful human beings, and we're so glad. We have a wonderful guest from Boise, and they're at 1 o'clock over in the Coeur d'Alene Lake Room. They have a great presentation on human rights, comparing the two countries. Then we have two panel members to join them, and they have one of them has also some video from Canada. So hope you'll come in. And again, Elizabeth, thank you very, very much. You have really brightened our day. Thank you for coming.